So in our first panel, we have two very different approaches, although using and looking at historical sources and trying to understand sort of the context of history in its own time, and in particular, Arvinder's case, is seeing what are the manifestations that in the present. So I'm going to ask a few questions before turning it over to the audience to get a chance to ask for clarifications, ask for whatever specific questions that you may have. My first question I'm going to turn to you, Sukhdeep, is you talked about at Takht Hujur Sahib that there was a sort of that sometimes they read Guru Pratap Suraj Prakash as well as Pangu's Pant Prakash. I wanted to ask, what is the relationship between the two texts? Is there sort of intertextuality? And what did Kavi Santokh Singh draw upon? And what did he also reject from Ratan Singh Pangu? Either way.
This might be easier. Yeah, it's an interesting question because those two texts, people have thought of them as kind of opposed. So first of all, for those who don't know, Pant Prakash, Ratan Singh Pangu's Pant Prakash was written in the early 19th century as well. I think around 1820s, which predates Santokh Singh's Suraj Prakash by maybe 10, 15 years. It's around the same time though. But largely, Ratan Singh Pangu's Pant Prakash focuses on the life of Guru Gobind Singh and afterwards. So the Misl period, how Khalsa got Raj. It was written basically because when the British were in India in the late 18th century, this is like prior to the time of Ranjit Singh, and they've been coming towards the time of Ranjit Singh. They had asked, I forget the colonel's name, but a British soldier had asked Ratan Singh Pangu how basically Khalsa got Raj. How did they knock down the Mughal Empire? And so Pangu's whole response, the context of his book is written in that light. He's responding to colonial questions about how Sikhs got sovereignty. So he's mainly writing about the establishment of the Sikh Empire there. So whereas Santokh Singh's writings cover the lifetimes of the Gurus, so they're quite different in terms of what they see as sovereignty and what they see as Sikh identity as well. So people have thought of them as, in that sense, opposed, but in one sense, they work on the same continuum because one deals with, prior to the Misl period and one works after. So I think that's why Takht Hujur Sahib has them in rotations. So first they'll have Suraj Prakash, they'll try to get through that, which would take quite a long time to go through it every day. So they'll have that, and then following that, to fill in the rest of the history up until Ranjit Singh, they will have Pant Prakash Katha every day as well.
Next, I wanted to turn to Arvinder Singh and just share in terms of when you were sort of conceiving of this project. What are you hoping that the Sikh community, because calendars, as you shared, there's always been contention, there's always been discussion. You pointed to the fact that, and it's actually very rare, it's been commented I think on one paper that I'm aware of when Banda Singh Bahadur actually declared sort of a year zero, so to speak, and that's extremely rare in world history. The only times I'm aware of it is during the French Revolution and actually during the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So such things are, and then certain millenarian sects have as well. But I wanted to ask, sort of, when you were starting off in this project, what did you think that the implications could be for today? And sometimes calendars continue to be extremely contentious. What sort of what role can we have? So what attracted you to the Nanak Prakash calendar, and what sort of role do you see it having forward for the community?
Okay. So I think thanks for the question. I think it's the same. I think my motivation and my journey are two different things. I think my motivation was the same. Motivation for coming to this conference as well. I think it's a young people's conference, and I think my first paper was about 10 years ago. But I also see not as many people within our own community who are doing a lot in terms of code or in terms of open source work that needs to go in towards a lot of our issues. In terms of the motivation of exploring this, I think it was I wanted to understand for myself, right? What does actually Nanakshahi mean, right? And instead of reading the news, I went to the source. I think during that journey, one, I got a little bit better understanding of where pulsing was coming from, and the issues with shifting of dates. Within that journey, I also experienced that there's actually the need of having a calendar is part of identity, right? Even the Baha'i faith, which is about 200 years old, has its own calendar. Islamic faith has its own calendar. Nations have their own calendars. So I think this whole discussion of Sikh community and Sikh nation, right? That those are two constructs as well. If we consider the idea of Sikh nation, part of identity is the flags are part of identity, but calendars, right? How are our dates conceived, right? How are our dates calculated? Are they still coming from the temple of Ujjain, which is like the source of the Bikram calendar? So those were all open questions. The other questions that I see, and I can see why the debate is on both sides. So within Sikhism, there is a spectrum of sampradas, right? And some of them are more close to being the reformers. The others are the traditionalists, and that always happens within any community as it becomes older over a period of time. But I think there's also this need for constant reinvention, constant exploration of some of the questions that need to be questioned or need to be addressed within the community. I think one thing I do recognize that there is no quick fix in terms of getting consensus of it all. But my motivation going into this, exploring this, was to shed some more light, right? Beyond just this discussion of should we adopt or should we not adopt, to actually explore what is it, what was the intention of the calendar, what is being explored, and to simplify it further, right? And I think that was my motivation to actually come here to this conference and talk with the younger people, because I think some of the things we can touch on and then somebody else picks up that problem and that particular question and takes it to its finality.
And I wanted to commend you, Amandeep Singh and Param Singh, in terms of creating new neologisms in the Punjabi language for the technical. I mean, I love that idea of tundkal. I mean, that's highly original. I'm most familiar from the Islamic context, where you call the advent of the Hijri of Muhammad as Jahiliya, as the age of ignorance. So, the age of fog is an interesting take on that as well. I'll open it up to the audience. I know I have a couple of questions of my own that I'll reserve until if there becomes a lull, but I'll give the audience far more time to ask any questions or share any thoughts or insights that they may have. If you could just raise your hand, and I'll send it your way. And Gurjeet Singh will be coming around with the microphone.
Thank you. Ever since I was a child, I've been immensely interested in the Nanakshahi calendar. So when I saw your presentation title, I was very interested. My question to you today is the Nanakshahi calendar merely a form of preserving history, or does it hold convenience for an older generation of Sikhs in America?
Can you repeat the question? Can you elaborate a little bit on the question?
So you talk about the Nanakshahi calendar, and you talk about how it has a historical impact, how it came to be after Baba Banda Singh Bahadur. But my question to you today is it merely a form of preserving the Sikh history and culture, or does it hold convenience for an older generation of Sikhs in America? Is it more convenient for them to be using the Nanakshahi calendar over the modern day calendar?
So I think I can't speak for the older generation. I think I'm still young, but I think there are multiple implications of having the calendar, right? Yes, it does make it a little bit easier to observe the connection between Gregorian dates and Nanakshahi. But I think let's make these things clear that they are not the same. Nanakshahi is not built on top of Gregorian calendar. They both use tropical year as the standard, which is, if you look at, there was, from Julian calendar, there was a shift, there was a consistent shift of time that was happening. It was Pope Gregory who basically did that correction and corrected the time that is being considered for the length of the year based on the tropical calendar. And as I demonstrated in one of my slides, the shift that happens using the tropical calendar is 1 day per 3,300 years, which is quite long. So I think the motivation for the calendar from that context, there are 3 motivations that I shared. One is the part of the identity, that the source of the dates are our own and not coming from the calculation of things beyond our own belief system, right? But in terms of the motivation for the adoption of Nanakshahi is to address that idea of disconnection that will happen over the time between the seasons and the months as described in Gurbani. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I was going to chime in a little bit. The other thing also, I think, in terms of the calendar, it doesn't replace our current calendar that we use in our everyday lives. Actually, I think Poliwara was here a few weeks ago, and the best analogy that he kind of made was in terms of you're going to use the calendar that you get paid on. At the end of the day, that's why during Ranjit Singh's period, they started getting paid on those dates that were attached to a certain calendar. So we're not going to, you're going to get paid every other Friday, and that calendar is going to shift. What this particular calendar does is it just sets the date. So for example, just as one example, Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Gurpurab would always be January 5th, and not January 6th one year, January 13th one year, and shift around as the sun or the moon does shift. So it's the same calendar, it just fixes the dates on a particular date, going back and then doing it that way. Just something to check in, and then going to a question.
Yeah. My name is Jitendra Singh Hundal. My question is directed towards Sukhdeep Singh. You mentioned that Suraj Prakash has been used as a standard historical studies in our Gurdwaras during Katha. GPC has recently commissioned Dr. Kripal Singh to re-edit and publish the Suraj Prakash. And during his publishing, which several volumes have been published, Dr. Kripal Singh has decided to remove many of the portions, and which he considered, in his team's opinion, as anti-Sikh philosophy. That's a major portion of it that has been removed. Do you still believe, after all this, that we should use Suraj Prakash as a standard historical document to teach history? Even a major portion of it is anti-Sikh.
I think that sentiment about portions of Suraj Prakash that may be problematic, that's existed since it was published by Bir Singh in the 1920s. So there are portions within the Suraj Prakash that may not suit well modern readers' engagement with the text. So there are mythological stories in there, which people they'll be, this is, did Guru Nanak go to the land of the ants, and this is not possible, so, let's just cut this story out. But a lot of the stories in there are not meant, like a mythological story may not be historically true in the sense of a Western understanding of a historical story. It's maybe driving home different ideas about the philosophy. But do I think that editing should exist? I think it would be kind of foolish for us to look back at that text and edit it out. It would probably be better to just look at it as it is and understand it as a product of that time. Because, text prior to that, like Bangu's text, and also texts that come after that, they all have a context. And they're all written in a specific time period, and we should be mindful of that, more so than looking at it and trying to take out, okay, this is good, this is bad. I think that would probably be a better approach to engaging with the Suraj Prakash. Is to understand that that text has a context as well. It probably had an audience as well that we should be aware of. And I think it'd be kind of foolish to go back with our mentality now and try to just take out what we find acceptable and not.
My question is kind of multifold, and it's a question for Sudeep Singh, and it's also as well as a rebuttal to certain schools of thought in today. With the Suraj Prakash Granth, I know it details certain things of which today in Sikhi may have fallen out of practice, such as Chakka Maryada, Shikar Maryada, the use of Shahidi Deg for assistance in meditation and to sharpen the skills of a Kshatriya or a Sikh or an Aham in battle. I know you have extensive experience with things in the Gurdwara and the Dal Panth, and you've done extensive research into a lot of things that are put up and that may seem today post-Singh Sabha movement and the creation of the SGPC and certain groups such as the missionaries that have discarded certain things that were unquestionable and everybody followed prior to 1920 and with the establishment of colonialism. Would you say that certain things today in Sikhi, that which in my opinion was a watered down colonialized version of it, which most people can come to know, they do not accept what it was prior? Do you feel it is, like you said, foolish to just discard things that may not necessarily seem in line with Sikhi, and just stick with things such as certain things that may seem more Hindu, such as texts in Dasam Barni, Sadru Barni, and basic things within this plain Adi Guru Granth Sahib that may appear as Hindu? Because in my personal belief, in the course that I've done and following up on your research, I've come to believe that if we, by deletion of certain things with our own history, Ityas and Puratan Granths, if we delete everything that seems Hindu, there won't be much left.
I think that's why these texts are interesting to go back and look at, because then we get to see, if anything else, we can see, okay, this is what people in the 19th century thought Sikhi was, if anything else. And then beyond that, we can look at, okay, how these things have changed over time. If you do have a collection of texts from the 19th century, 18th century that mention certain practices, and now we can look and, okay, how come these practices are not currently being done in the Gurdwara, or maybe certain philosophies or certain ways of framing Gurbani, they've gone out of vogue nowadays. Why is that? And then we can get a better light on perhaps the audience shifted, perhaps certain realities in economics have changed, perhaps certain philosophies have lost vogue. So, in the 19th century, we see that Vedanta was very, in style, same with the 18th century. So perhaps that's the reasons why, that framework was placed upon understanding Gurbani at that time. But yeah, if anything else, looking back at these texts, they help us shed light on parts of our history that have been unexamined for a long time. And if you do travel in India and you do go to certain Gurdwaras, maybe outside of Punjab, their conception of Sikhi is different. And that's just interesting, because then you can see, okay, why is that different than Punjab? What was the context in Punjab that may have changed our understandings of Sikhi? So yeah, this is why pre-colonial texts are interesting, but we do have to understand that even the pre-colonial texts, like Suraj Prakash, Pant Prakash, and then the ones that came before that, Punjabi Nama, Guru Bilas Pasha Shami, they all had their own context as well. They all had their own authors. They were writing for a specific audience as well that we have to be mindful of. But
yeah, I would like to add a comment on the questions for me. I think this is a discussion that Paul Singh deals quite a bit with, which is this idea of why do we have to change the calendar? We already had Bikram calendar. Bikram calendar was there in the Guru's era, and it has been used, for the past couple of centuries. And I think it reminds me, there's one Punjabi poet who says, ਪਾਣੀ ਵਗਦੇ ਰਹਿਣ ਖੜਿਆਂ ਬੁੱਸਦੇ ਨੇ ਬਹਿੰਦਿਆਂ ਸੌਂਦੇ ਨੇ. So the idea is like the waters have to continue flowing, but that's it. So I think if the idea becomes, instead of let's write over this and adopt this, or let's just stick with what is there, I think both of those I find very extreme thought processes. I think the idea should be continuously, as the time changes, as you said, the time has changed. As you continuously evolve, question what is there without replacing what is already there. So I think our instead of just rewriting history, just looking at history from the context of what it was, being in that time, being within that context and exploring it that way, while still looking towards the future and inventing what are the things that we need to address as we move towards the future, right? There's no mention of computation, 100 years ago, but now as a community we have to deal with it, right? So those kind of things, right? So I just wanted to put my thought in it. Thanks. Yeah, please.
I did want to ask something about the Nanakshahi calendar, because it seems strange to me that how do we balance really this? Traditionally, that we see that we have a lot of festivals that we celebrate, Diwali, Holi for like Hola Mahalla on Holi. Traditionally, we had the Sera celebrations as well. So there's a long tradition of kind of the community interacting with the broader community as well. So how do we balance the fact that, we're going to make our own calendar, so we're kind of separating. How do we balance that out by, being a part of a larger community as well, which, has historical precedent as well?
I think that's a very good question, because that's a question I constantly, kind of struggled with. And I think and this is again, what I have come to conclusion with, it's not right or wrong. I think one is the idea of separation of faith and the culture. I think within the idea of the faith, or you're exploring things within the context of that very thing, and within the idea of culture, you're exploring all the other associations that you have. I think the other question I have there is, if not Nanakshahi calendar, then what, right? Then what is the source of those dates, right? Is the source of those dates then being defined by another tradition, right? Whose some of those things we may agree with, some of the things we might not agree with, right? So I think I do not have the answers for this, but specific answer for how do we reconcile this all. But I think one thing is for sure is that if we continue to observe without defining our own standards of how the dates would be, or what our needs of how do we look at time, and how do we look at the relationship, or how do we look at the relationship of Qurbani within the seasons, all those different things. Those are very faith-specific things, right? Which may not be an addressable problem for the larger community, right? But how do we reconcile these two things together? I think that's a question that is probably for the larger community to address. But I think the alternate, which is not having a calendar of our own and just going with what has been happening, we see that it will have impacts on some of the things that within our own faith, which we have to address sooner or later.
We have about 5 minutes. Any last questions?
Hi, this is to both people on the panel. We talked a lot about understanding context for both of your research. Is there any homework that you would want to give anybody here to kind of understand the context of kind of the economic past or any social movements that were going on at the time for the calendar, or for any sort of text that would help people understand a little bit more, kind of getting into your research?
Sorry?
Their own website, probably.
Yeah, you'd have to have pretty good Punjabi skills to get through that. There are like dikas, there are commentaries written in Punjabi on Suraj Prakash that you could read. I'm assuming that might be difficult for a lot of the audience. So, I mean, that's part of the struggle in academia now, is that a lot of the pre-modern, the pre-colonial works, we were talking about this yesterday, there's no scholarship on like Gur Pratap, Suraj Prakash, there's no scholarship on Panch Prakash, there's no scholarship on all of these texts prior to the British, right? And that's a huge problem in the West for people like us, right? Because we get fed whatever we hear at the Gurdwara, somebody tells us, a Gyani tells us, right, at the Gurdwara. We don't know what the source of that is, which is why I found Suraj Prakash so interesting. When they would have Katha of Suraj Prakash, a Gyani just doesn't come up and just tell you, oh, I heard a story from Suraj Prakash. They always have a tradition where you have a party there reciting the Suraj Prakash, and then the Kathavachik does it line by line, almost to ensure that, okay, there is an authority here. You know, this does go back. This is actually what is written in the text. And that's been a tradition since its inception, which is really interesting, different than today, where you just have a Gyani go up and he can say whatever he wants to say, right? There's no standard. So, I mean, that's really problematic that these texts are kind of lost on the youth here today, that it's inaccessible to them. So homework for that is learn Braj Bhasha. It'll take you the next 10 years. If you want to learn anything about these types of texts, so Suraj Prakash is written in Braj Bhasha. You can read Alison Bush's Poetry of Kings. It's just an interesting book that gives you insight into the type of poetry that was being written at that time. So that'll also give you insights into Dasam Granth as well. Anything from going from the 18th century to the 19th century, that type of literature, that would also be a Rasi type of literature. It'll give you insight into that. So it's called Poetry of Kings by Alison Bush. But anything Sikh specific, yeah, this is where the scholarship lacks, and this is why you can probably share more on that.
The one thing I would share, and I apologize for cutting you off, is, you know, like, a lot of these older scholarships, these like little books you'll see even at like Mele and like even religious ceremonies, like, I mean, these are real jewels. Like, if you ever see like Pyara Singh Padam's books, I mean, like, and the Punjabi that's used is not, look, I mean, there's no way to skip over the homework one has to do to just get used to the Gurmukhi alphabet and to just improve your Punjabi, which is people are like Arvinder and Sukhdeep in a very different light are doing and have done. But some of those books are really, I mean, that level of scholarship, I mean, today working in a Western institute, I'm blown away of like Jaggi, Pyara Singh Padam and the level that they were able to do, which doesn't mean I like wholeheartedly accept all their conclusions, but you know, where they very, very simply, because it was actually for an audience that wasn't necessarily the most scholarly audience. It was actually, a lot of times they're writing for a lay audience. So those types of books that you'll see Singh brothers or like that constantly reproduce, I would really, really highly recommend, just as a learning exercise for yourself, but really possibly as an entryway into some of these texts and some of these issues as well.
Yeah, I think for the Nanakshahi calendar, I would say, you know, the authority of the text is Purval.biz, and there are papers, number of papers there. The predominant one being Gurbani and Nanakshahi calendar. That's a good paper to read and kind of go through, and very well written. In terms of, you know, the Gurmukhi Punjabi context, there are fewer sources out there. There's you know, we run a resource called Punjabi Lab. There's Kuka, Punjabi Kuka. You did quite a bit of work on the Gurmukhi and Punjabi aspect of it. If you want to contribute, there is CLDR, which is the Common Liquid Repository Database. It opens up twice every year, and they accept, you know, new translation of strings that go into all the softwares that you see out there. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the resources to get started. And, you know, if you need some more resources, just drop us an email. I think it's on Punjabi Lab. It's just drop us an email and we'll help you out.
Any last questions?
Well, I also today. Recently, in the last 10 years, there's been a deep, renewed interest in a lost cycle of time known as a great year to the west, to Plato. Essentially, the precession of the equinox of our Earth, a grand cycle of 24,000 years. Our Bani does reference this cycle as well as Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, of course, which we are in right now. How do you reconcile this seemingly impossible knowledge that the Earth is round and cycles around
1,000-year orbit within our body. What does that mean to Sikhs in terms of our understanding of the cosmos and our place within it?
Okay. Thanks for the question. I think I haven't looked at that specific text, but I think one of the things when I was looking through Puriwal's paper, he was mentioning there's a lot of reference of a lot of different types of frames of time, right? So there is a kadiye visiye chasi kadiye para thiti vari mahua suraj ek ko rutan ek nanak katte ke kete, right? So I think the idea that Puriwal puts in there is that many of these references, like gurus observed the natural phenomena not as to observe them, but to use them, like they use them as reference in Gurbani to convey a different message. So I'm not specifically aware of that particular problem that you're talking about, but I'll look into more. But I think one of the ideas that I want to put in there is from the calendar's perspective. From what I have read so far, the idea was that yes, there are certain frames or certain measurements or certain units of time that have been, that are not in use. There are a variety of different units in time, and there are certain ones that are chosen. I want to say something.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that Banda Bahadur, so he declared a year 0, and then he said that, okay, now we are starting Satyug right now. So it's interesting how he used a different frame as well there. And it's interesting how that changes as well, the perception of time, how that changes perhaps understandings of Gurbani, especially in the Dasam Granth, of what it says, how time is going to unfold. Certainly Banda Bahadur's conception of that was quite different than the Tat Khalsa's perception of that as well. So, different groups had different perceptions of what time meant for them, which we also have to be cognizant of as well.
Correct. Last question, and then we'll move on to the second panel. If actually all the second panelists, if you can email your presentations if you have it, please.
Since you brought up the term Tatta Khalsa, I know the Suraj Prakash, I heard it, also details the split of the Khalsa into the Tatta Khalsa, which in its modern form today is the Buddha Dal and Dal Panth, and the Bandai Khalsa, which was a group of Sikhs who followed Banda Bahadur and accepted him as their guru, and they changed their Barna from blue to red and embraced ideas such as vegetarianism and other things and such, and just strictly followed Banda Bahadur. And along with the idea of, how you said, year 0 became Satyug, where I know in Jobis Avtar, it talks about, another Vedic text, it talks about how the turn from Kal Yug to Satyug, and the Buddha, how the Panth Pathshah is given the title of Shan Mikror to symbolize that once there are Shan Mikror Khalsa, will be one the establishment of Khalsa Raj and one step closer to Satyug. And then I believe, if I remember correctly, right at the turn of Kal Yug to Satyug is when Kalki Avtar will arrive, and then from what I remember, basically destroy all of existence, in which the Akal Purkh will create the universe again in a new Satyug, in which, like, if you think about it, it's just a continuous cycle, Satyug, Treta, Dvapar, Kal Yug, Satyug, Treta, Dvapar, Kal Yug, and so on. And I remember I think it was called Ustat, where it talks about how there were many versions of the 3 Devtas, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, where it talks about how, I can't remember the Pankti exactly, where it talks about how there were many that came before and there will be many after, aside from the ones who we know. I guess what I'm trying to say, would cross-referencing these Itihasic Granths with other Gurbani, such as Dasam Bani, all 3 Guru Granths essentially, and other Itihas, would that be a better pinpoint to establish what Sikhi really is, as compared to reforming it with certain things in the post-colonial era to make it more Christianized in a sense, and as opposed to the Khalsa Panth staying Nyara or different?
Well,
There was a lot in there. But, firstly, in regards to the Bandai Khalsa versus Tat Khalsa, certainly the text, at least from the 19th century, even 18th century, if you think about Bansali Nama, but Ratan Singh Pangu's, Pant Prakash, Suraj Prakash, they mention how certainly there were different groups that held different views. So the Banda Bahadur's group didn't necessarily get along with the other Sikh groups at the time. That's well documented in there. And actually, Pant Prakash, it has been translated into English, and that you can look up. So for those that wanted, a gateway into this world of literature, that is the one text that has been translated from that time. So you can Google Ratan Singh Pangu Pant Prakash, and you should be able to find it. It's a reasonable translation. So certainly different groups had different conceptions about time, and it's interesting that you say that, because when you look into, you mentioned that line in Akal was ek shiv pe, ek gaye, ek fer pe. So one Shiv came, one went, and another one came. And Shiv being the destroyer of the world, somebody who at the end of these cycles destroys the world. These conceptions of time, in the East where it's cyclical versus in the West where it's linear, that plays a lot into the philosophy, and that plays a lot into why perhaps in India, they may not have thought of history in the same sense that people think about history in the West. And we got that question earlier about perhaps we should just remove the mythological portions of Suraj Prakash. Those conceptions about what is history in a linear sense, that's a very Western concept. And having grown up here, it's for us, the youth, it's very hard to get rid of that. But we should be cognizant of the fact that prior to the British, in India, they had a very different notion of time, which makes this project very interesting because what notion of time are we attributing to the Nanakshahi calendar? Are we looking at the Nanakshahi calendar as having perhaps the same mindset that the Gurus had in their time when they were talking about time? Are we fully being cognizant of how perhaps they viewed, time as cyclical, as perhaps maybe not meaning as much as what people think about time here in the West as a very linear, progressive cycle? These are all just questions that we have to think about. And certainly the portion that you mentioned in Dasam Granth, where it talks about how, Kalki Avatar comes at the end and then the cycle continues, is certainly evidence of the fact that they thought about time as very cyclical and kind of continuing on till infinity. So, yeah, it's just a lot to think about, I guess, if you were trying to make a calendar.
Yeah, I think also one of the things I would like to add is to look at the Gurbani in the larger context and not be selective. I think there's also a reference from Gurbani here, I remember, which is like, Kisan Bisan ka khuna te kaan sune pehchan kun so libla ki moni pakin so, right? So I think Gurbani, I think as I've grown older, one of the things I've explored is like Gurbani is a lot of, each time you go through an iteration and you find and newer meanings and newer connections to it, and a lot of it is dependent on the state of the mind that you are in at that point of time. So I think there is the faith construct of things, which is like it should Sikhs be allowed to explore Suraj Prakash. I think again I'm no authority on this, and my brother over here is far more authority, but I think in my personal experience what I found is that I think there is no restriction in terms of what you want to explore. But as a community, as you grow, as a construct, as you grow, as an organized, there are certain things that there needs to be institutions that have to move forward. So that construct has to be kind of taken into account. So it's a fine balance, right? And I think this kind of discussion, I'm glad this is. I think one of the things I loved about Jakarta is like this is the place where these kind of discussions can happen in a very, very open manner without going at each other's neck, which is good.
So if I can get a big, big hand of applause for Next I'll turn it back over to our host, Dave Walter.